Shadow Hack. Chapter 411, Getting Control of the Island. After Li Yunmu introduced himself again, both Zheng Xuan or Luo Honghua were left completely dumbstruck. Compared to him suddenly attacking and killing Zhang Yuan and the others, his identity as a descender from another plane was far more shocking to the two of them. They had never expected that a person viewed as a native by them would show up to be the same as them. Only Wang Yan, who had prepared herself mentally, wasn't as shocked. She only looked at Li Yunmu with a complex expression. All of a sudden, Zheng Xuan seemed to have lost his spirit and mumbled in a daze, "Finished, we are completely finished." Descenders from all planes were all clear on the fact that they were each other's mortal enemies because of heavenly transformation. In the end, only one of the 66 planes would continue to exist. Since they were mortal enemies as well as competitors from their planes, it was clear that one of them had to die. "Impossible, impossible, how can the descenders from your plane be so formidable?" Although Zheng Quan's heart had already been crushed, Luo Honghua was still unable to accept what had happened. However, it wasn't so surprising. Originally, Li Yunmu hadn't been so formidable after descending. His strength had perhaps been a little higher than that of Zheng Xuan, but only by a little. In comparison, Zheng Quan's group was actually way higher in battle capability than Li Yunmu's side. Demon being beaten almost to death by someone from his group clearly illustrated that point. The blame thus lay in Li Yunmu's recent increase in strength, which defied common sense. The refining pagoda and the system had obtained him his first profit in the origin world. Afterwards, as the defects in his flux points were corrected and he obtained a large amount of extreme-grade power grain, both his physical strength and flux energy skyrocketed. It could be said that the current Li Yunmu was around 3 times more formidable compared to when he had descended to the origin world. With that, it wasn't a wonder that Luo Honghua was unable to accept his power. Even if she quickly increased her strength after coming to the origin world, she still would have remained unable to see the shadow of Li Yunmu, who possessed the heaven-defying cheat. Li Yunmu was suddenly distracted for a moment, then a smile made its way up his face. He changed his mind and said, "Nothing is impossible. For the sake of Wang Yan, I won't kill you too. Both of you shall live out your remaining years on this island." When he exposed himself, he had been prepared to kill everyone present except Wang Yan. But at that moment, because of one thing, his thoughts changed. "Ha ha ha, Li Yunmu, you don't say. You exaggerate your strength greatly. Even if we all were killed by you, you still wouldn't be able to escape. The ghost silk pollen isn't infinite. One day, you will use it all up, and that day will be the day you die," Luo Honghua yelled with madness in her eyes. How could she still not guess the reason behind Li Yunmu's survival? Once she saw the ghost silk pollen sprinkled on his body, she understood everything straight away. She suddenly turned toward Wang Yan and maliciously spit at her, "Bitch, you sold out our world, you f***ing whore." But before she could finish, Li Yunmu kicked her away. "I'm sorry for being distracted. Something unexpected happened. From this instant, the island will be under my control," Li Yunmu said with a smile, and his gaze turned toward the boundary steel. Seeing the sudden change in his mood, everyone couldn't help but look over in the direction he was looking. Until that moment, they had been fine, but once they did look, they were left in shock. What's going on there? Wasn't the shadow already swallowed by that toad? Zheng Xuan involuntarily cried out. Li Yunmu had to accept that the scheming of Zheng Xuan was really smart. Previously, he had acted as if he was completely in despair, which focused Li Yunmu's attention on Luo Honghua, while in reality he didn't believe that he had lost everything. Because he still had his trump cards. Li Yunmu might be very powerful, but as long as he could seize the control of the island, he could still make his comeback. However, when he saw that at some point in time Li Yun had surprisingly reached the boundary steel and its light had completely enveloped his body, approving him as the successor, Zheng Xuan felt real despair. He all hope of staging a comeback. Just as Li Yunmu had said, after that unknown life form obtained the approval of the island and became its successor, then there was no need to speak of Zhang Chuan with his tricks. Even if there were another 100 of him with their 100 trump cards, they still wouldn't have any hope to succeed. Li Yunmio continued smiling, not replying to his question. In fact, he himself didn't know how Li Yun had managed to change the situation at the crucial minute. He had also believed that everything had been ruined at the last step. Otherwise, why would he have become so enraged and went berserk on these people? Yet the outcomes of some matters in the world were wonderful like this. Li Yun had dodged the final attack of the toad and successfully obtained control of the island. Although there were some glitches in the proceedings and the person who had obtained the approval wasn't Li Yunmu himself, the end result was still great. Li Yun controlling the island was the same as Li Yunmu controlling the island himself. As expected, when the light from the boundary steel which had enveloped Li Yun's body faded, the hostility from the surrounding insect monsters toward Li Yunmu completely disappeared. After that, Li Yunmu took the initiative and began to walk toward boundary steel. When he went past the 1,000 defender toads, the evolved monsters didn't show any malice or intent to attack. Seeing this, Zhang Chuan and Luo Honghua's bodies went soft, as if this outcome had sucked all the strength out of their bodies. The other members of the group, on the other hand, became completely relaxed. Although they didn't know the origins of these descenders, they understood that once the island was under Li Yunmu's control, they probably wouldn't die. It might not be great news for them, but given their present situation, they had nowhere else to go. After all, the path which connected the island to the outside world had collapsed long ago. At that time, they had lost all hope of returning to the origin world and didn't have much expectations for surviving the insect monsters. But once Li Yunmu became the successor, their life was guaranteed, and a good death was always inferior to being alive. If one was alive, they could still find a chance to change their destiny. When Li Yunmu reached the boundary steel, Li Yun transferred everything that had happened when he obtained the island's successorship to Li Yunmu's consciousness. See Chapter 412, Ruthless Devouring. So it was like this. After receiving the information from the shadow, Li Yunmu immediately understood everything. He had never expected the true origin of the dimensional spaces in the origin world. They apparently were divine planes created by ancient gods. The island actually wasn't a naturally formed plane, but rather a man-made one created by an ancient god during ancient times. However, could no longer be called a divine plane. When a plane lost its ancient god, it also lost its divinity. Because of that, they were no longer divine planes. After existing for so long by themselves, after their god had died, they gradually came to be known as dimensional spaces. 90% of the people didn't know about the origin of the dimensional planes. But once Li Yun became the successor of the island, the secret history was naturally explained to him. In truth, the island was left behind by the ancient god who possessed the divinity of magnificent creatures. It was that ancient god's primary divinity. This entire island had been created and nurtured by him, including the magnified plants, insects, wild beasts, birds, and so on. The only thing he didn't touch were things that weren't alive, like sand and rocks. Due to that, when Li Yun obtained the boundary steel's approval, all the magnified life forms became completely obedient to him. In reality, it was equivalent to gaining the control of the entire island. From all that, one question arose immediately: how were the divine planes which had degraded to ordinary dimensional spaces different from Li Yunmu's heavenly world? The answer was simple. The former was inherited from others while the latter was nurtured by oneself. The difference between them was also that Li Yun had only obtained the resources left behind by the ancient god while Li Yunmu was capable of utilizing the world power of the entire heavenly world. Within it, he was a god. Li Yunmu took a long time to absorb the information sent by Li Yun while also inputting it within the system's database for further analysis and deductions. Are you still elder brother Yunmu? At some point of time, Wang Yan had walked to Li Yunmu's side and spoke to him with a haggard face. Li Yunmu turned to look at her and replied only after a long time. Perhaps for others I may no longer be the previous Li Yunmu, but for you, I will always be elder brother Yunmu. Really, no, even if you are lying, everything was worth it for this one line. A hint of a smile broke out on Wang Yan's haggard face. Soon after, she fell into Li Yunmu's embrace. Elder brother Yunmu, if one day you find no choice but to fight against people of my world, Yana requests you that you should leave behind a bloodline of the people from my world, Wang Yan said and gradually closed her eyes. Host, she has swallowed a large amount of poison. She will die quickly, the system warned Li Yunmu in his mind. What happened here? Did you poison her? Li Yunmu was suddenly enraged, but he discovered that the signs of her life were quickly depleting. Every hint of her vitality was fading away. Such a situation was even more grave compared to that of the widowed Nakt of Hall clan. Without any hesitation, Li Yunmu quickly took out the sacred life water and poured 3 drops into Wang Yan's mouth. No reaction. It was too late. Wang Yan had not left any opportunity for Li Yunmu to rescue her. But the next instant, the outstanding life-saving technique Major Reversal began its work, and a green light enveloped Wang Yan's body. Sacred life water together with Major Reversal were unbelievably potent. No one had expected that Li Yunmu would have such terrifying trump cards. Perhaps even Wang Yan herself hadn't expected that she, who was so certain of her death, would surprisingly be brought back to life. Gradually, Wang Yan's cheeks gained some color. Li Yunmu had forcibly brought back a dead person to life. When Zhang Chuan and Luo Honghua saw it, a fear concealed in the depths of their eyes could be seen. This Li Yunmu isn't only formidable, with strength surpassing other descenders, but also possesses outstanding life-saving techniques. There truly wasn't any comparison between them. Li Yunmu was probably the greatest threat for any descender. After a long while of trying to rescue Wang Yan, her vitality finally returned. System, her vitality has been restored, so why isn't she waking up? Li Yunmu asked in a cold voice which would give chills to anyone who heard it. Although the large dose of poison had been cleared, she had swallowed a rare type of poison which attacks the nerves. Her brain has been damaged, the system replied after a short silence. I only want to know how I can wake her up, Li Yunmu said, interrupting the system. As a matter of fact, his emotions toward Wang Yan weren't that deep. Since the beginning, he hadn't thought of her in that way, but he knew that he owed her too much. Honestly speaking, it could even be said that he had used Wang Yan's feelings toward him to learn the secret of ghost silk pollen. This was the true reason behind his guilty conscience. However, although he knew it, if given another chance, he would take the same course of action. Because from the beginning, descenders from the others' planes were his mortal enemies. Li Yunmu couldn't possibly miss this opportunity and allow Zhang Chuan and his group to obtain the control of the island. It would decrease his own chances of survival. After some pondering, the system gave a blunt reply. According to the data gathered, the system doesn't have a response to host's question. Presently, everything depends on her will to live. Li Yunmu sighed deeply. His gaze suddenly fell on Zhang Chuan and Luo Honghua. It isn't related to us, she herself took the poison out of shame. Zhang Chuan hastily tried to clear his name. Yes, it really isn't related to you, but since Wang Yan is unable to live, then there's no need for you two to remain alive, Li Yunmu said in a soft voice. But those words were like a death sentence to Luo Honghua and Zhang Chuan. You cannot do this. Just now, you promised to let us live in front of everyone, saying that we can spend the rest of our lives on this island. At that instant, Luo Honghua was finally afraid and began to panic. Before this, she hadn't expected that the native whom she disdained from the beginning would be able to take control of her life. I said it, but now I changed my mind, Li Yunmu replied, which made Luo Honghua realize what sort of character she was facing. It wasn't someone who clung to the old ideas of honor and pride, who could be deceived easily by her charm. No, let me live. I am ready to do anything for you, anything. As long as you let me live, I am willing to do anything, including using my body to entertain you. Luo Honghua's legs went soft. She promptly knelt and started begging for forgiveness from Li Yunmu. When facing death, this formidable woman who looked at all men in disdain finally revealed her most primitive instincts. All right, then you go to hell first and wait for me there. You must wait for me nicely, okay? Li Yunmu replied with delight while nodding. The next instant, a red tongue wrapped around Luo Honghua who was screaming miserably. Before anyone could do anything, its owner swallowed her whole. The sound of gulping caused everyone to tremble. After seeing that Li Yunmu remained unmoved in front of Luo Honghua's cries for mercy, everyone dispelled the nefarious intentions in their hearts. Compared to normal death, being devoured by a toad was far more terrifying. Chapter 413, Frozen. The sight of Luo Honghua disappearing into the toad's stomach terrified everyone. Zhang Xuan kept sweating continuously, but he forced himself to calmly ask, "What could I do to guarantee my life?" "You are an intelligent person, much smarter than Luo Honghua, so you should understand," Li Yunmu replied to him. After a long while of hesitation, Zhang Xuan asked in a decisive tone, "What secret do you want in exchange of my life, so that I can still continue to live on?" "There's no guarantee. You can only put your trust in me." "All right, I will inform you about the passage to return to my plane Go Dai." Suddenly, Zhang Xuan rebelled and rushed to attack him. Clearly, the word compromise didn't exist in his dictionary. There was no way that an arrogant person like Zhang Xuan would accept his loss graciously. Because of that, there was no way he would make any other choice than to make a last attempt to regain his freedom. Zhang Xuan knew that even if Li Yunmu abided by his promise and allowed him to live on the island until he died, what sort of life would that be? His only option was to attack Li Yunmu. If he succeeded, the unknown shadow life form would also dissipate or perhaps die. As long as that happened, the island and its inheritance would return to being without any owner. Only then would Zhang Xuan have any chance to make something of himself. Even if such a chance was minuscule, he had to try. With that thought in mind, Zhang Xuan used his final trump card and risked his life with it. However, Li Yunmu wouldn't be defenseless. Zhang Xuan understood that the opponent would be vigilant against him, since no one would be so stupid to trust an enemy so soon, but he still had to fight for his chance to survive and follow his ambition. Although his trump cards were very formidable, this was all he could do. "Li Yunmu, accept your death. You forced me to do this." Zhang Xuan howled loudly, but his figure began to run away from the location. At that instant, he didn't throw himself at Li Yunmu, but instead began to flee from the location at his top speed, which caused everyone around him to look around in confusion. Wasn't he going to fight for his life? Then why was he running away crazily? Only Li Yunmu understood what Zhang Xuan was doing at that moment. Nuclear power? The legendary forbidden grade energy which was used by humans before the Dark Ages. Li Yunmu had been prepared for Zhang Quan's tricks since the start. But when he saw the descender throw out a micro-bomb, he was filled with curiosity toward the most powerful energy under human control before Dark Ages. He knew that this sort of energy had disappeared from the annals of history long ago. Even now the Alliance of the Six Continents prohibited the research into this field because of its destructive power. There was no need in the New Age for such energy which was only created for destruction. The micro-nuclear warhead which Zhang Xuan had gotten from somewhere might have been really small, but it had the power to destroy the area of a whole mile around itself. If Li Yunmu didn't have an approximate guess of Zhang Quan's trump cards, then maybe he would have been finished at that instant. Even if he had survived because of his defense and speed, he would have been gravely injured. But when Zhang Xuan triggered the micro-bomb, Li Yunmu had already begun to act. He didn't make any large movements, just waved his hand, and the bomb which hadn't yet detonated was sucked into his two-sun heavenly world. The next instant, the micro-nuclear bomb was frozen by the world power inside. External assistance. In the end, Everything was external assistance. Li Yunmu gave his evaluation in a calm and collected tone. Zheng Quan's final weapon was also based on external factors. But if truth be told, Li Yunmu himself wasn't much different. Azure Dragon Deity Battlesuit, Forbidden Weapon Runic Spears, Snow Guzzle Thunder Blade, Underworld Raven Sage Bow, and so on were all tools which provided external assistance. Strictly speaking, even the system and shadows were external assistance. It was because of it that Li Yunmu hadn't said those words only for Zheng Chuan, but also to make himself aware of it. Li Yunmu wanted to make sure that he didn't forget this fact and remained alert about not staying dependent on external factors for the rest of his life. What sort of trick did you use to make the bomb disappear? When Zheng Chuan had run several hundred meters away from the bomb, but didn't hear it explode, he turned around to see what had happened. At that moment, he suddenly discovered that his trump card had been neutralized. What you should understand is that I don't possess the trump cards you do, and you don't possess the trump cards I do. Li Yunmu laughed. Indeed, Zheng Chuan didn't possess his own heavenly world. Even if he was a very outstanding youngster in his world, things like heavenly worlds didn't grow on trees. Even if his family had one, it wouldn't be a surplus which they could share with Zheng Chuan, who would be considered too young to possess one. Because of that, Zheng Chuan didn't have a heavenly world. The reason why Li Yunmu possessed one was because he had fought to obtain it for himself. And because his luck had favored him. My loss wasn't random. Seems like you are really a terrific character of your world who possesses an extraordinary background. Zheng Chuan didn't flee. His body was surrounded by a shining golden energy cover. Li Yunmu was certain that it was a very advanced product of dimensional technology which ordinary people couldn't obtain. That cover would have allowed Zheng Chuan to survive the impact of the micro-nuclear bomb. From that, it was obvious that the defensive capabilities of that golden cover were extremely great. It may even be able to surpass Li Yunmu's absolute defense. But the difference between that defensive cover and Li Yunmu's body armor was that Li Yunmu's defense would remain with him all the time, while Zheng Quan's could only be used until its energy ran out. You are wrong. I am only an ordinary person. But I had my lucky encounters. All right, now, let me witness your final struggle. After successfully collecting the nuclear bomb, Li Yunmu didn't care about talking nonsense with the opponent and meaningfully looked toward Li Yun. The next instant, the magnified insect monsters gathered in the vicinity rushed toward Zheng Chuan like an ocean tide. At this time, Li Yunmu experienced that even if Zheng Chuan had countless trump cards, under the attack of the magnified insects, all of them were worthless. Although Zheng Chuan kept struggling bitterly, the insect monsters kept rushing toward him unceasingly. By using all the tricks and trump cards up his sleeve, he managed to survive for an hour. But once he exhausted his bag of tricks, he vanished in an instant, without even his bones remaining behind. Chapter 414, The Final Victor. When Zheng Chuan had revealed all of his strength without holding anything back, he Miao, Wang Ru, and the others who had been restless from the start were completely stunned. It showed up that among those who kept their presence low and didn't stood out wasn't only Li Yunmu, but also Zheng Chuan. At least, given Zhang Yuan's strength, it would have been impossible for him to preserve for a whole hour against all the insect monsters. Descenders from Earth? What sort of existence are they? At that moment, all the survivors were completely astonished. But the more they knew, the more restless they became. In the end, Wang Ru summoned her courage and asked, Yunmu, how do you plan to deal with us? I haven't decided yet. You should know that since you have learned the secret of this island, then regardless of who stood in my place, they wouldn't let you reveal the secret to the world, Li Yunmu said after a moment of being quiet. If he could choose, he naturally wouldn't involve Wang Ru, He Miao as well as the honest Liu Zhong in his schemes, but the matter at hand was just too important. He couldn't show the slightest mercy. I understand. In the end, you are also the same as Zheng Chuan and Zhang Yuan and want to kill us. He Miao said with an extremely bitter expression. Hearing it, the faces of others turned deathly white in an instant. But they didn't show any resistance. Regardless of whether it was Zhang Yuan or Luo Honghua or even Zhang Chuan who struggled until the end, their instincts told them that this matter was already settled. Any resistance would be nothing more than a waste of energy. Silencing you is obviously the best course of action, but I won't do that. You can all reside on this island. Li Yunmu's words relieved everyone. However, when they remembered that they couldn't return to the origin world, not even step out of the island, their excitement dampened. But they were still very fortunate. If in the battle between Zhang Chuan, Zhang Yuan, and Li Yunmu, the final victor would have been anyone else except Li Yunmu, they most likely wouldn't have had any chance to keep their lives. You, and you. Choose a piece of land in the neighborhood and construct a wooden house there. Compared to how politely Li Yunmu treated Wang Ru, He Miao, and Lu Zhong, he wasn't the least similar to the other 4 people who had betrayed the alliance and entered Zhang Yuan's faction at that time. Li Yunmu didn't feel any goodwill toward such turncoats and naturally wasn't polite when asking the 4 of them to do something. He simply gave them a command. The 4 of them were flux experts, so if they really were in a hurry, they had enough energy and strength to create a small wooden castle in a few days. Hey, I still have something to request from you. Suddenly, Lu Zhong, who had been silent until then, spoke up. I hope that you can take good care of my family in the outside world. All right, don't worry about that. At least from the financial side, I can assure you that they would face any problems, Li Yunmu replied after some thought. Then I can rest easy here. After receiving Li Yunmu's promise, Lu Zhong looked at him with appreciation. The ways of the world were always strange. He was being grateful to a guy who had trapped him. Naturally, he understood that if it had been Zhang Chuan or Zhang Yuan who'd taken control of the place, then not only would his family not be taken care of, there would have been no guarantee that they wouldn't be silenced just to make sure that no one asked questions. With that being the alternative, Lu Zhong felt quite fortunate, and being an honest person, he felt truly grateful toward Li Yunmu. Then let's do this. I won't put any restrictions on your movement, but I hope that you won't approach the center of the island with any nefarious thoughts. After making arrangements for the 3 of them, Li Yunmu had no time to pay attention to the 7 people and returned to the boundary stele. He sat down cross-legged near it and closed his eyes to rest. Lately, he had used up too much energy. The first thing he did, however, was to dispatch the 8-dimensional space eyes. Now that Li Yun controlled the island, the magnified insect monsters would definitely not attack them. Thus, his first action was to use the dimensional space eyes so the system could gain a thorough understanding of the island's geography. The system then quickly got busy with the task. After that, Li Yunmu finally settled down and began to investigate Danger Critical Extinguisher, which he had comprehended previously. He knew it was something special, but the moment he opened its description, he was stunned. The newly comprehended extinguisher wasn't just one move, but rather a set of 7. Of them, except for the first one, the others were hidden behind a black line with a question mark on top of it. They were completely unknown. In other words, Li Yunmu had only comprehended the first move of the 7. After pondering it for a while, Li Yunmu finally asked, "System, what was the approximate level of the extinguisher's strength when I used it?" According to the total strength of the extinguisher as well as the strength displayed by you, if all of that strength was concentrated into one strike, then it could kill an initial level Great Flux Master. The transformation of the Danger Critical Strike was caused mainly by Flume Thunder energy, the system quickly replied. When Li Yunmu heard it, his heart skipped a beat. Although he had prepared himself mentally, the system's evaluation still left him astonished by the strength of Extinguisher's first move. Initial step Great Flux Expert. As long as he used Extinguisher, he could kill such a person in one strike. What did this imply? The flux experts of the origin world were far more formidable than Earth's fluxers. Even initial stage Great Flux Masters were roughly comparable to Earth's Nirvana stage experts. Before Li Yunmu had descended, Lin Yuero had informed him that she had just risen to Nirvana realm from temporal realm. He had believed that he would need a very long time before he could reach her level, but if he used Danger Critical Extinguisher, he could kill an expert on her level, which was only second to sages on Earth, without much trouble. Nirvana-level experts on Earth were considered too formidable. Because of that, Li Yunmu had never expected that he could reach it in such a short time after coming to the origin world. Middle-stage Great Flux experts approached Sage layer in strength. High-stage Great Flux Masters could beat new sages easily, and those in the Great Circle of Great Flux Master realm were equivalent to his Earth's quasi-deities. With a quick calculation, Li Yunmu understood the strength of Danger Critical Extinguisher. But unfortunately, there were harsh requirements to use the skill. Not only could it be triggered only under the most dire of circumstances, it also consumed all of his strength. Even if Li Yunmu could use a pinnacle technique like Major Reversal, he still wouldn't risk using that skill under normal circumstances. Soon afterwards, Li Yunmu's gaze fell upon the newly comprehended shadow skill by Li Yun Shadow Carapace. After carefully investigating it, he became aware that the only reason why Li Yun had been able to dodge the tongues was because of the enlightenment he had gained from image substitution evasion. From it, he had created his own skill, Shadow Carapace. Simply speaking, Shadow Carapace was quite similar to image substitution evasion. It was modeled exactly after that skill. Because of that, the Li Yun which had disappeared in the stomach of the golden toad hadn't actually been Li Yun, but the Shadow Carapace, his substitute. But this shadow skill didn't have the evasion part of image substitution evasion. Due to that, his newly comprehended technique could only allow him to cheat death. There was no follow-up technique to allow him to escape using the opportunity. Chapter 415, Direction for the 6th level. Regardless, Li Yun had successfully comprehended the first shadow skill, which finally completed the necessary condition for the system to upgrade to the 6th level. It had to be known that because of this unknown condition, the system's upgrade had been delayed for a very long time. After upgrading to the 4th level, the system had gained the ability to exploit the space elements and create cultivation relaying globe. As long as Li Yunmu had a completed source manuscript, the system could create cultivation relaying globes without end, limited only by the number of space elements. Although such an ability didn't sound that great, it provided a good enough foundation for Li Yunmu to establish a sect and nurture 300 ape gods. In the future, it would become one of the main reasons behind why the ape gods could become a formidable backup. The ability gained by the system upon reaching the 5th level was script hacking. In simple terms, this ability removed the restriction of hacking zone from the shadows. They no longer needed to remain at a certain distance from the host. The best example of this basic ability was the current situation of Li Yunmu being an incredible distance away from Blue Moon Island, but his shadows still hacking like usual. They were still following the systematically planned out hacking orders without any problems. In other words, after the system was upgraded to the 5th level, Li Yunmu no longer needed to pay attention to the hacking areas. Even if he didn't do anything, he would continue obtaining experience and ability points. From all that, an obvious question arose: once the system was upgraded to the 6th level, what new ability would it gain? Li Yunmu was looking forward to it with expectations. He wanted to know about it since a long time ago, but because of the seriousness of the situation, he didn't have enough time. But once the situation finally stabilized and everything was under his control, he naturally wanted to see what sort of formidable ability the system would gain after reaching the 6th level. At that point, the system will reach selective evolution, which will proceed according to host's choices. Thus, the new ability will depend on the host. The system replied to Li Yunmu's queries. What does this mean? What choices do I have? Li Yunmu's eyes began to shine. Before he could think much, an information window appeared in his consciousness SES, and the system gave two choices to Li Yunmu. Those choices were about the direction which would determine its evolution in the future. The first choice was non-interference system. With this choice, the system would continue to evolve according to the established direction and choose its evolution by itself. The second choice was interference system. With this choice, the system would evolve by considering the circumstances faced by the host. When Li Yunmu looked at the two choices, he was somewhat conflicted. It wasn't that he couldn't understand them, but that they had different pros and cons. In simple terms, the first choice allowed the system to upgrade by a prearranged plan, but the new abilities it would gain may not be useful to Li Yunmu in his circumstances. In the long term, however, they would definitely become useful. After all, the system had certainly meticulously analyzed its direction for evolution and wouldn't act without rationale. As for the second choice, it would allow Li Yunmu to choose the new ability which would be beneficially to them right away. Naturally, this would be extremely great to deal with whatever he faced at any particular time. System, what choice are you inclined towards? After thinking for a long while, Li Yunmu gradually made his decision. But before voicing it, he still wanted to hear the system's thoughts. The system is sorry, but it doesn't have the authority to determine its direction for evolution. Everything depends on the host's wishes, the system replied without thinking much on it. Oh, is this to avoid influencing me? Once Li Yunmu heard it, his thoughts became complex. He hadn't expected that the system would be capable of thinking in such a human manner. Yes, that could be considered to be true, the system replied. That's all right, I won't put you in an awkward position. I will choose the second option. I want the new abilities to be practically useful, Li Yunmu replied with complete certainty of his choice. It was clear that after pondering over the problem, he had prepared his answer with certainty. A choice that lacks foresight, but is indeed very practical, the system said, giving its evaluation of Li Yunmu's choice. Ah, what do you mean? Are you praising or mocking me? Li Yunmu remained unmoved, though. He was someone with his own definite views. Since he had already made his decision, he wouldn't regret it. Perhaps he did indeed lack foresight. However, Li Yunmu understood long-term strategies were all bull. All of it was unknown, just a lie. Although, the word blueprint of future sounded beautiful, it was describing just fleeting clouds. Why, you ask? Because if you are unable to control the present, everything will be in vain. All the beautiful words will be just a moon seen in the water. Only by controlling the present could one fight for actual benefits. Although the benefits he would obtain would be small, but considering the situation, his advantages would be something real. Both praising and mocking the system replied honestly. Li Yunmu couldn't help but ask the system out of curiosity, then according to your reasoning, what choice should we have made? According to reason, it seems appropriate for the system to choose the first option, but the system didn't finish its words. What else? You aren't finished yet, right? Yes. Most of the previous hosts had chosen the first option and were usually defeated in the future, the system replied after a moment of silence. Li Yunmu almost coughed out a mouthful of blood. He understood, almost thoroughly understood it. System? Intelligence? Ability to calculate and predict? Even if the system was an unprecedentedly intelligent product, it still wasn't perfect and had flaws. Perhaps it was very formidable, but it still failed sometimes. Li Yunmu rejoiced that he hadn't changed his mind and stuck with his own choice. Then you should get busy with finishing the last matter and start updating yourself. Li Yunmu finally laid out his plans. The system had scanned the geography of the island with the help of the 8-dimensional eyes. Terrain, weather, the distribution of living organisms as well as their strength to the smallest detail were all stored in its database. Only after completely understanding the island could Li Yunmu move on to the next step of exploiting it. That task had kept the system busy, and the first shadow Li Yun had also joined in. After all, being the one who had the highest authority in the island, he needed to offer his assistance to the system in every way possible. Chapter 416, Long-Term Recuperation. The busy period lasted for full 3 days. In other words, the system had to postpone its upgrade for 3 days. After delegating the most important tasks, Li Yunmu began a tour of the island. He roamed around it for 3 days, and in the end, he was completely satisfied by the resources he saw. The island perhaps couldn't be counted among the highest level dimensional spaces of the origin world, but it definitely wouldn't be low on the ranking. Besides, the power he had inherited was also extremely promising. The magnified insect monsters were the core strength of the island, but Li Yun still needed time to control it. Nothing could be accomplished in one step. Everything required a period of time to be accomplished, even if it was inherited. After 3 days, the 4 turncoat members finally finished a small wooden castle at the center of the island under Li Yunmu's command. It wasn't very large, only occupying 3,000 square meters and having 2 floors. But it was sufficient to act as Li Yunmu's temporary shelter. Especially since it was constructed like a holiday resort. After some thinking, Li Yunmu decided to invite Liu Zhong, He Miao, and Wang Ru to reside in the castle as well. As for the 4 turncoats, he didn't care much what they did. In fact, they should be grateful that he wasn't treating them like slaves. Li Yunmu didn't bother himself with them and just allowed them to stay at the outskirts of the forest to drag out their ignoble existence. Compared to the 4 of them, Liu Zhong and the 2 women got far better treatment. After a few days, the 3 of them gradually accepted their new reality. After all, they weren't fools and understood that it was impossible for Li Yunmu to let them out because of the secret of the island. It was his bottom line. Even if Li Yunmu didn't want to lock them up, he had no other choice. Thus, after 3 days, they accepted his invitation, and Liu Zhong took the initiative to become housekeeper of the castle. All the livelihood requirements were arranged by him. He Mian and Wang Ru voluntarily took the jobs of cooking the food and cleaning the castle. On the 4th day, they heard a piece of information which gave them a hint of hope. Li Yunmu declared in front of them that when his strength had reached the level when he didn't need to worry about the consequences of people outside finding out about the island, he would allow the 3 of them to return to the origin world. Thus, Li Yunmu urged them to not neglect their cultivation. He also prepared some extreme-grade power grain to help them with that. If the freedom in the origin world wasn't enough to convince them, then this treatment was able to turn what they saw as tragedy into a fortunate encounter. Naturally, given that the 3 of them hadn't cultivated superior body refining methods, it didn't take much effort from Li Yunmu to make preparations for their cultivation. After all, the amount of power grain which they could consume every day wasn't much, let alone the number of extreme-grade power grain. On the 5th day, the system had finally completed its survey of the island. It then immediately began to upgrade under Li Yunmu's request. The time required for that was very long. It far surpassed the time taken by the system during the 5th upgrade. Surprisingly, it was 3 whole months. Li Yunmu had to accept that the system's previous words were correct. The 5th level system could only be considered to be in the lower mid-grade. But when it entered the 6th level, it would truly become high level. Above the 5th level, the conditions to upgrade the system were extremely difficult to fulfill. If not for Li Yun, who had followed Li Yunmu from the start and had been carefully nurtured by him, probably none of the other shadow would have been able to develop intelligence so quickly and comprehend their very first shadow skill. Since Li Yun had done so, it meant that the other shadows could duplicate it for themselves as well. 3 months is just perfect. I also need to enter seclusion for recuperation and consolidation after the quick increase in my strength in the recent times. Li Yunmu chose that period of time to enter seclusion in the castle. Time continued to pass with the dreary life at the island. Although Li Yunmu had spoken of recuperation and consolidation, the increase in his physical strength wasn't slow during this time, given that he possessed a sufficient amount of extreme-grade power grain. His strength continued to increase, gradually reaching toward the peak. When he checked his strength after a month, he discovered that it had reached a new peak. If his physical strength had been 35 oxen before, then now it reached 40. It had broken through to another level. Although it had only increased by 5, Li Yunmu was still astonished by such an increase. It had to be known that the peak physical strength of Flux expert level was 50 oxen. The closer one got to it, the more difficult would it become to increase. The reason behind Li Yunmu's strength breaking through 40 oxen wasn't simple. It was mostly due to the large number of extreme-grade power grain which he had consumed every day, as well as the soaking in the medicinal bath made according to Meridian Nurturing Flux Point technique. With those two things, his increase in strength was monstrous. Liu Zhong, He Mian, and Wang Ru's improvements also didn't fall behind. In fact, they improved even more quickly than Li Yunmu. After all, their individual strength had been at low level. On top of that, what caught everyone off guard was that the amount of flux energy drifting in the island exceeded the amount of flux energy moving through the origin world. Thus, regardless of whether it was their physical strength or flux energy, all of it had increased quickly during the month. In Liu Zhong's case, it was still all right, but in the case of He Miao and Wang Ru, who were extremely weak before, the increase was the most prominent. However, Li Yunmu's cheerful mood started going down when there was no news. On the 5th day of the next month, there was still no sign from the Pathfinder Wasp. However, Li Yunmu had already determined that the underground cave for which Zhang Xuan and other descenders had entered the island was precisely the cave in which he had taken refuge from the attack of giant ants. This was because during the system's survey of the island before it started upgrading itself, many underground caves had been discovered, but there was only one which appeared extremely bizarre and mysterious. But Li Yunmu wasn't too anxious about it. Instead, he continued to wait patiently until the system upgraded to the 6th level before exploring the cave again. Perhaps that place concealed a way to return to every parallel plane from the origin world. Chapter 417, Earth's Chaotic Situation. It had already been 2 years and 6 months since Li Yunmu and the others had descended. After full 30 months, the Black Dragon Island gradually began to fade away from everyone's minds. With time, everything would be forgotten, or at least dulled. Even the rumors which were previously flying around about Earth's hope for heavenly transformation being on the island lost its interest when no news about it came, and with time, the ordinary people began to forget about Black Dragon Island's experience. It was until one day. A loud bang shook the whole world. Black malicious energy charged out from the Black Dragon Island like lava from an erupted volcano, and rushed into the horizon. This scenario was like the birth of a powerful monster. In a split second, everyone on the 6 continents was affected. Yes, it was everyone. Even the consciousness sea of ordinary people who hadn't cultivated flux energy was occupied by the malicious black energy. Darkness enveloped their vision as well as other senses. It was like light had vanished from the whole world, for everything had turned pitch black. This was the result of a person's soul being completely blocked out by the malicious energy. Close to 300 million people, countless different beasts, and any life form which had intelligence had simultaneously closed their eyes at that moment, as if worshipping something, and concentrated their attention on Black Dragon Island. That direction is. In the main palace of War God Temple, Battle God fiercely opened his eyes, waking up from meditation. His eyes, which were extremely ruthless as if thunder was flying through them, turned toward Black Dragon Island. But it was useless. Even if he was publicly proclaimed as the most powerful person on earth, his vision, his 5 senses, and even his spirit were full of boundless darkness. Black Dragon Island. It's the Black Dragon Island. On the 6 continents of Earth, one by one, quasi-deities, battle sages, barbarian kings, ocean emperors, and all the sages, looked toward Black Dragon Island with uncertainty. At that instant, all the humans of Earth rose in an uproar. Before long, Battle Sage Vega's image appeared in front of Battle God in War God Temple and spoke in an extremely serious yet slightly forceful tone. Stop the war. I feel that an unprecedentedly malicious creature has arrived at our great homeland. After pondering for a moment, Battle God finally declared his position. All right. After the dark curtain retreats, I will personally arrange peace. Everyone realized that an event which could cause the formidable battle god to take a step back couldn't be resisted. Moreover, after 2.5 years had passed, the heavenly transformation was coming closer and closer. There was no other choice than declaring armistice, since Earth didn't have much time left. They had to settle all internal strife before the heavenly transformation. In fact, after Li Yunmu's generation had descended to the origin world, many major events had happened on Earth in the 2.5 years. Among them, 2 matter were the most important. First was that Flux ancestor had left this world. It had sent the 6 continents into chaos. Flux ancestor perishing was something which the people of the 6 continents couldn't have ever imagined. So at first, people thought it was impossible. In the eyes of everyone on Earth, Flux ancestor was an entity closest to God. But during the major descending 2.5 years ago, he had perished. Until that day, those who weren't privy to all the facts didn't know what his death truly signified. But the people and influential clans in the highest echelons were clear that his death meant that they couldn't send any more descenders to the origin world ever again. In other words, they had lost all hope of following up with their infiltration. Their only hope was the final generation of descenders. The second matter was internal strife between the 6 continents of Earth. Ordinary people couldn't understand why all the powerful people in the world had ruthlessly attacked the sacred continent's divine religion just after returning from the Black Dragon Island. Similarly, those who didn't know the true situation could never comprehend why had Northern Heavens come to support divine religion to withstand the attack of War God Temple, Ocean Temple, and Barbarian Shrine. All 3 of them condemned divine religion as the worst criminal in the history of humanity with countless rapacious designs. However, divine religion didn't fall back and condemned War God Temple, Ocean Temple, and Barbarian Shrine for betraying humanity before heavenly transformation. In short, all the transcending powers were in conflict with each other, pushing the Earth into another chaotic period like the Dark Ages. People even came to call the last 2.5 years as Second Dark Ages. Every day, the powerful transcendent, temporal, and nirvana flux masters would die in the war between the 2 major factions. At an interval of every few days, a powerhouse which had recently entered Sage Layer would perish in the meaningless internal strife. The only transcending power which hadn't participated was Blood-E-Wood, which was situated on the higher dimensional continent. After returning from Black Dragon Island, it closed itself. It severed all connections to the outside world and also prohibited its disciples from going out. Even now, when the 2 factions formed by the transcending powers had entered a heaven-shaking earth-shattering war, Blood-E-Wood remained like a mute and deaf person, staying within its own world. Damned Flux Association! At that time, Flux ancestor shouldn't have passed on the responsibility of Flux Association to MOU. Thud. The 4 barbarian kings were gathered together on the desolate continent, and Barbarian King Coiling Dragon smashed his hand heavily on the marble table. When their barbarian shrine had allied together with War God Temple and Ocean Temple to suppress divine religion, the matter seemed to be very easy. Given that it was 3 against 1, they could use the excuse of punishing the criminal of humanity. Regardless of whether it was favorable to rain, weather, or number of people, they possessed absolute superiority. But when the 3 transcending powers had declared war against divine religion, they realized that they had been gravely mistaken. Before the war was publicly declared, divine religion had kept waiting patiently and concealed itself deeply, which made everyone underestimate it. That's why when Frontline Heavens suddenly entered its faction, the enemies felt that the situation had suddenly become extremely complicated. But the situation hadn't yet been too grave. The factor which had truly shaken the war between the 2 factions was the behemoth Flux Association after it had lost Flux Ancestor. Chapter 418, Ling Shuang returns. MOU, who had been given the responsibility to take care of Flux Association by Flux Ancestor, surprisingly chose to stand on the side of divine religion and Frontline Heavens. In an instant, it balanced the power of the 2 sides. Divine religion, which had been the underdog at first, instantly saw their fortunes change. These events led the chaotic situation on Earth. Both factions blamed each other for selling all of humanity on their Earth. People's lives and future prospects had sunk into unprecedented abyss, to the point that no one could be trusted. If Earth's situation was to be described in one word, it would be collapsed. With the 6 transcending powers losing all public credibility, the continents also became hostile to each other and entered the whirlpool of war. If a power with absolute dominance didn't intervene, the internal strife would continue until one of the 2 factions was completely annihilated. But finally the situation changed for the better, after more than 2 years of chaos. However, this better turn wasn't because of good news from the transcending powers as the people of Earth had hoped. Instead, all the people of Earth, including those of transcending powers and influential clans, had been overtaken by a terrifying malicious energy. The enemy has called for a peace conference. I guess we all know the reason. Battle God, Battle Sage Vega, barbarian kings and ocean emperors reached a decision at lightning speed. They sent a message to a secret meeting point with divine religion where Supreme Pontiff, frontline god of frontline heavens, and MOU had also gathered. I hadn't expected that the uncompromising battle god would surprisingly concede because of this matter. Frontline god sighed, but battle god's decision made them feel extreme pressure from the malicious energy rising from the Black Dragon Island. What are they saying? Asked a woman with an enchanting body over which she had draped a black gown that covered her entirely. Only her hands and lower leg could be seen, where her snow-white skin was revealed. She was the type of woman who didn't need to show her skin, for just by seeing her voluptuous body most of men would be intoxicated. But only Frontline God and Supreme Pontiff knew that MOU wasn't an ordinary female. Let bygones be bygones. Ally with us to face the heavenly transformation as well as this malicious energy, Supreme Pontiff read the message aloud. I feel like we don't have any choice other than negotiating a peace, Frontline God agreed without raising any conditions. What about you, Madam MOU? Supreme Pontiff narrowed his eyes toward the enchanting MOU. Ask them to publicly acknowledge my status and existence, she suddenly said. I will talk to them about that. Time is of the essence, so I doubt they will make any excuses. Then let's stop war and go talk peace, Frontline God said to her. After that, something happened which neither of the 300 million people on Earth had expected. The internal strife between the 6 transcending powers which no one could have stopped was suddenly over because of the sudden eruption of the malicious energy from Black Dragon Island. Of course, the only reason it happened was because when the energy erupted, the quasi-deities felt incomparably heavy pressure. According to legends, in ancient times before Dark Ages, Kunlun Mountain 1 was a sacred mountain within the western part of the central continent. It possessed the palace of heaven which humans couldn't even imagine, and a deity-level existence resided there. But all of that was just a folk tale or perhaps a rumor, maybe even a simple myth. Kunlun Mountains of central continent just possessed a large amount of evolved beasts. It was the only region where humanity approved of their existence, because there were 9 sage beasts residing on the mountain range. The 9 beasts were all comparable to Choutian bird. If their blood was refined to produce a drop of sage blood, it could create a sect or a sage bloodline. Each of the sage beasts was comparable to 2 or 3 battle sages or quasi-deities because they possessed innately formidable bloodlines. Thus, Battle God representing Central Continent, had signed a secret non-interference treaty with the sage beasts. The 9 beasts agreed that the evolved beasts of Kunlun Mountain wouldn't step outside the mountain range to create problems for humans and humans wouldn't enter the Kunlun Mountains. It could be said that this was a secret of highest level which almost no one knew about, including even the outstanding people from the younger generations like Hai Yu and Mantian, let alone Li Yunmu. On that evening, the mountains which weren't open to humans had a visitor. No, it would more accurate to say 2 visitors. They walked from far away toward the Kunlun Mountains at an unhurried pace. 9 senior sacred beasts, you all are already old and your sage blood has been silent for a long time. It's time you returned nature. A strong and robust silhouette mumbled near the entrance of Kunlun Mountains. From his tone, it seemed like he didn't put the 9 sage beasts in his eyes. After they used their power, the entrance to the Kunlun Mountains couldn't be seen or found. Ordinary fluxers who didn't have any special secret techniques would never be able to walk into the true Kunlun Mountains. Even if they tried to search for them, they wouldn't find the entrance, let alone manage to intrude. But at that moment, the concealed entrance to the Kunlun Mountains seemed to be wide open in front of the newcomer. If Li Yunmu had been there at that instant, his mouth would have dropped to the ground from astonishment. The two people, the master walking in front and the servant walking at the back, were surprisingly his former followers, Barbarian Niu and his close friend Ling Shuang. Unexpectedly, they hadn't died in the dragon mist of Black Dragon Island. Instead, after 2 years, they had again appeared in the world. But their appearances were quite bizarre. And Ling Shuang was a servant. How could this woman, with her proud and arrogant nature, become Barbarian Niu's servant? Chapter 419, Followers. Li Yunmu, who was cultivating on the island in the origin world, naturally had no clue about the chaotic situation on Earth in the last 2 years, let alone that his former acquaintances Barbarian Niu and Ling Shuang, who should have perished in the depths of Dragon Mist, had returned to the central continent. But their actions were extremely bizarre. How had Barbarian Niu become the source of the terrifying malicious energy which scared all the powerhouses in the world? And how could Ling Shuang, a woman with strong will and a proud nature, accept to become his servant? Every little thing about them was extremely strange. Li Yunmu didn't know anything about it, but if he did, he would certainly understand they now held a lot of secrets. All the powerhouses in the world were searching for the source of the sinister energy, but no one could find it. When Barbarian Niu returned to the central continent, he went to Kunlun Mountains, where he shook the whole place sheltered by the 9 sage beasts as if he was the local god of that area. But no one outside the region noticed it. Even the quasi-deities and battle sages with the sharpest senses had no idea, as if some sort of barrier had arisen to obstruct their senses from sensing the changes. After Li Yunmu had led Barbarian Niu, Demon, and Li Qinghong to descend to the origin world, Blade Overlord, who had returned from Black Dragon Island, brought Underworld Hand, Devil Monkey, Nangong Gongzi, and Flowing Cloud to reside in the depths of Moro Mountain Tenebrous Hidden Domain. The 4 formidable halted Fluxers together with Flowing Cloud occupied the terrifying region after the Peak Flux disciples had descended to the origin world. Other 5th-dimensional Fluxers didn't know what was their aim behind isolating themselves in the Moro Mountain Tenebrous Hidden Domain. But those who had a great information network had guessed long ago that Blade Overlord and the other 4 were protecting the secret realm discovered by Li Yunmu before. The depths of Moro Mountain Tenebrous Hidden Domain was a region which very few Rainbow Crystal Fluxer dared to visit. And because of Blade Overlord and the other 4 who had occupied it and were killing everyone who intruded, the hidden domain gradually faded out of public memory. Although many people had had designs upon the secret realm discovered by Li Yunmu, they dispelled such thoughts because of the 2 reasons. Blade Overlord and other 4 were extremely low-key during the time and had remained in the abyss of the hidden domain without ever coming out. But that day, while the 5 of them were calmly cultivating in secret, all of them froze. Astonishment appeared on their faces. "It's Barbarian Niu, I'm not mistaken. This presence definitely belongs to Barbarian Niu," Underworld Hand suddenly said while looking toward Kunlun Mountains. After returning from Black Dragon Island, Blade Overlord had brought the unfortunate news about Barbarian Niu. All of them thus believed that he had died in the depths of Dragon Mist. But on that day, his unfamiliar yet familiar presence startled all 5 of them. "Yes, I can barely believe that it was really Barbarian Niu's presence. How is that possible? He actually returned from the Dragon Mist Abyss," Nangong Gongzi said with extreme astonishment. Regardless of whether it was Barbarian Niu or them, all of them were Li Yunmu's followers whose soul imprints were bound to his heavenly world. Because of that, a formless connection existed between them. When Barbarian Niu had come out from Black Dragon Island and went to Central Continent's Kunlun Mountains, they had immediately sensed that apart from the 5 of them, a 6th follower had showed up on Earth. It should be Barbarian Niu. According to what I know, apart from us, Master didn't have any more followers. If it is not him, then who else could it be? Flowing Cloud still adorned a cyan gown. When it was coupled with her beauty, she was like a fairy. But her presence was even more concealed and formidable than before. However, if Barbarian Niu returned, why hasn't he come to the hidden domain first and met with us? Devil Monkey asked suspiciously. I feel we should go out now. First to investigate what's going on and second to use the opportunity to rescue Master's family. Nangonggongzi suggested. No, without my order, no one can take even half a step out of the hidden domain. Everything will proceed as our master has planned. Blade Overlord immediately vetoed his suggestion. But the situation on Earth isn't very safe. War God Temple and Battle Sage Vega are going to enter a fierce battle with Divine Religion faction at any time. I'm afraid that Master's parents aren't too safe in Vega City, Flowing Cloud couldn't help but say. When Li Yunmu left the world, even he hadn't expected that a huge war would break out between the 6 transcending powers, affecting not only the 6 continents but also every single battle sage and quasi-deity. Even the supreme defender of Central Continent, Battle Sage Vega, was involved. If Li Yunmu had expected this, he might not have left his family's security in her hands. But who could have expected such a thing? According to the circumstances at the time, it was supposed to be 5 transcending powers jointly attacking Divine Religion. But in the end, Northern Continent's frontline heavens rebelled, after which the behemoth Fluxor Association also went to stand by the side of Divine Religion. It then resulted in a deadlock between the 2 factions. Throughout it all, Li Yunmu's followers had been holed up within the 5th dimension with their strength increasing greatly. Flowing Cloud's concerns are reasonable. Although Master commanded us to not come out before 10 years had passed, he definitely would have told us to spare no effort to get his family to the hidden domain if he knew that such a chaos would descend on the world. Blade Overlord, you are very inflexible, Underworld Hand said as his brows wrinkled. That won't do. We definitely cannot go out. After Master left us, he gave me the responsibility to take care of all of you. I will deal with this matter carefully. Otherwise, if you show in the world too early, you may wreck Master's plans. Blade Overlord had firmly held onto his stance to keep them from interfering, but he had loosened a bit, because the matter concerned the safety of Li Yunmu's family. Regardless of whether it was Barbarian Niu or the war going outside, all of them were changing the situation. But if they left the 5th dimension and showed up outside, it would definitely affect Li Yunmu's plans. While the 5 of them were unable to come to a unanimous decision, suddenly a sound of faint footsteps came from outside. Their expressions changed instantly, but then returned to normal. Soon, a person dressed in black clothes to keep hidden rushed toward them. Reporting, there's urgent news. Chapter 420, Soul Imprint. Speak. If it was some ordinary matter, you wouldn't have taken the risk of entering the hidden domain. Quickly, tell us what you know. Blade Overlord's eyes narrowed as he waved his hand at the man. Reporting to Domain Masters. Yesterday, Battle God personally took the initiative to lead War God Temple, Barbarian Shrine, and Ocean Temple to Divine Religion's faction territory and launched peace talks. In less than a day, they agreed to peace without any conditions. The informer quickly reported the news. What? Battle God initiated for peace? Don't tell me War God Shrine and Central Continent lost the battle. The 5 of Fluxors were shocked and began to look at each other in astonishment. Battle God's fierce and intense style was deeply etched into their hearts. Earth's most formidable, strongest, decisive, and uncompromising person was the image of Battle God in the hearts of people. This also didn't mean just Fluxors like Blade Overlord and the others, but every single person in the Central Continent. Yet Battle God had taken the initiative to ask for peace. If that didn't mean that he had lost, then what else could it be? What could be the reason which forced him to cross his bottom line and take such an action which was thought to be unimaginable for him? For a while, the 5 people considered the guess that Battle God's faction of 3 had been defeated and that the 3 continents behind them had also lost. Moreover, they had lost so thoroughly that they had no chance of making a comeback. It's not like that. Everyone thought that at first, but it was quickly investigated and found to be false. Battle God's faction hadn't lost the war, but... The black-clothed informant slightly hesitated and paused. Continue. Since it is a matter related to the people standing at the top of Earth's power pyramid, I will allow you to speak your mind even if you are just grasping for straws. After learning that Battle God hadn't been defeated and the central continent hadn't lost, Blade Overlord's group breathed a sigh of relief. Whatever happened to Battle God or the central continent had no relation to the 5 of them, but given that it involved the safety of their master's parents, they had no option but to treat the matter with the great importance. Some unverified information has been circulating among the top powerhouses. According to rumor, there was a sudden burst of sinister energy from Black Dragon Island the day before. Because of it, all the 6 continents decided to quickly make peace. The black-clothed man quickly delivered all the information collected by the domain walkers. After Blade Overlord and the other 4 heard it, they were left speechless for a long time. They couldn't imagine how terrifying the energy which erupted from Black Dragon Island had to be to force the 6 monsters on Earth to reach a compromise without any disputes in a single day. All right, you go now and tell the leader of domain walkers to spare some effort and pay attention to Barbarian News whereabouts. In addition, keep your eyes on the situation of Master's relatives in Vega City. If there are any changes, immediately carry out emergency measures, Blade Overlord instructed before commanding the black-robed man to retreat. In the last 2.5 years, the 5 had strictly followed Li Yunmu's instructions and hadn't stepped out of Moro Mountain Tenebrous hidden domain. But it wasn't like they had lost all eyes and ears in the outside world. Because of the great increase in their strength, the 5 of them had formed a small but powerful faction of their own. It easily became one of the top 3 factions which shouldn't be provoked. Naturally, this was only in the 5th dimension, but there were still many benefits to leading a faction. One of them was domain walkers. They were the members of the faction which had a base in all the steel castles of the 5th dimension. Moreover, their feelers had also secretly sneaked into the real world. The domain walkers mainly constituted of people who belonged to the private powers of Blade Overlord, Nangang Gongzi, and other 6 halted fluxers. In the 2 years, the people under Li Qinghong, Demon, and Barbarian Niu had also been integrated into the underground organization controlled by Blade Overlord. Their main task was to collect information about the real world and act as the eyes and ears of their leaders. Domain walkers had spread quickly throughout the 5th dimension because they were composed of people who came from the private powers of the 8 halted fluxers, and because the 5 followers of Li Yunmu had become formidable to the extent that they couldn't be neglected in the 5th dimension. Blade Overlord and other 4 had been given the titles of domain masters by the people of the 5th dimension. It was based on the fact that the 5 of them occupied the entire Moro Mountain Tenebrous hidden domain. But everyone clearly understood that they weren't supreme existences, but also had a master named Li Yunmu. But he had descended to the origin world, and whether he was able to return or not was something which no one could tell. Some people completely ignored him, believing that no one from the last generation of descenders would return. But some people still held some hope. Some powerhouses, organizations, and clans had already begun to collect silk before it rained one. They took the initiative to establish good relations with the factions under those who had descended. No one could guarantee that there would never come a day when the descenders would establish a passage between the 2 worlds and return to the origin world. Even if the chances of it happening were 1 in 10,000, it might still happen. After the descenders had entered the origin world and stayed there for a long time before returning to Earth, their future strength and potential would increase greatly. Those with a foresight could see this and were quick in making relations with them. Thus, although Blade Overlord and his people had remained extremely low-key, many powers and clans had still established temporary friendship with him. As a matter of fact, even without Li Yunmu's influence, the 5 of them had already matured enough to become one of the overlords of the 5th dimension. Because of that, Blade Overlord and the others had great influence and possessed concealed power. After the black-clothed man had withdrawn, the 5 of them instantly looked at each other with fright in their eyes. What sort of existence could force the 6 behemoths to become so concerned? They didn't know much about it, but one thing was certain: they didn't need to continue arguing over the matter of whether to go out to rescue their master's relatives or not. Since the 6 powers had negotiated peace, their master's relatives in Vega City would remain safe and sound. Seems like we need to increase our strength quickly. Earth's situation is changing every day, and heavenly transformation is coming increasingly closer. We all must make preparations before Master returns, Nangang Gongzi said. With nothing else to discuss, the 5 of them quickly began to cultivate again, after making an appointment to meet up a month from then once more. Although Li Yunmu wasn't on Earth, they still had a vague connection with him because of being his followers. Even if they were separated by the energy barrier between the 2 worlds, their link wasn't completely severed off. Their soul imprint was still bound to Li Yunmu's heavenly world.